On the afternoon of the 26th of December 1900, a relief boat reached a small Atlantic rock and found 3 lighthouse keepers gone. The rock was Eilean Mor, the largest of the Flannan Isles, 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides. The boat was the steamer Hesperus, 11 days overdue, held back by weather. Our master sounded the steam whistle. He fired the distress rocket. Nothing answered. What had taken 3 train keepers off a 53-week-old lighthouse without leaving a body, a note, or a wow. 3 men, 1 rock, no bodies, 1 no bodies. This channel is called the Quiet Hill. This is the case of keepers of Eilean Mor. Their names were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald McArthur. They were employed by the commissioners of the northern lighthouses in Edinburgh. They had last been seen alive on the morning of Saturday, the 15th of December, 1900. 11 days later, the relief steamer climbed the long swell out from Lewis and put a small boat ashore at the East Landing. A relief keeper named Joseph Moore climbed the long flight of stone steps up to the lighthouse compound and found it empty. He ran back down to the landing and waved to the boat. What the popular telling has done with that silence ever since is the second mystery of this case, and the larger one. Chapter 1, Eilean Mor, Bartosan. The Flannan Isles are a scatter of 7 small islands in the North Atlantic. The largest of them is called Eilean Mor. The Gaelic name means big island. In absolute terms, it is not large at all. Roughly 39 acres, oval in plan. Cliffs rise sheer from the Atlantic on every side to a flat green tabletop about 280 feet above the sea. There are 2 places where a boat can put a man ashore, one on the east, one on the west. In any weather other than calm, neither landing is usable. In the 1890s, the commissioners of northern lighthouses identified the islands as a needed station. The design contract went to the family firm that had built the great majority of Scottish lighthouses for 4 generations. The Flannan Isles light was designed by David Allen Stevenson Patrol. It was first lit on the 7th of December 1899. The rotation was the one the Northern Lighthouse Board used for remote rock stations. 4 keepers were assigned to the light. 3 were on the rock at any one time. 6 weeks on the rock, 2 weeks ashore. The relief steamer made the run every fortnight, weather permitting. The light had been operating for 53 weeks when the man on the rock vanished. Chapter 2, the biographical record of 3 missing men is sparse. The principal keeper was James Ducat, 43 years old, 22 years in the lighthouse service. The second assistant was Thomas Marshall. 28 years old, unmarried. He had been at Flannan Isles since the station opened. The third man, the one whose presence on the rock changes the shape of the case, was Donald McArthur. He was an occasional keeper. That detail that McArthur was a stand-in, not a regular, turns out to be small and load-bearing. His name was Joseph Mor. Robert Muirhead, the Northern Lighthouse Board's superintendent for the Western District. Muirhead had hired Ducat, he had hired Marshall, he had hired McArthur, he had hired Mor. He had visited the rock on the 7th of December 1900, 8 days before the disappearance. The closing line of his eventual report describes that visit as the melancholy recollection that he had been the last person to shake hands with them and bid them 4 men on the rock, 3 would never be seen again. Chapter 3, December 1900. The Atlantic between the Outer Hebrides and the Flannan Isles in mid-December is not a kind sea. What survives from the rock itself for that week is small. It is the slate, a small chalkboard the keepers use to record observations through the day. They are the only surviving direct words from any of the 3 missing men. The last entry on the slate is for the morning of the 15th of December. On or about the night of the 15th, the steamer Archer was bound from Philadelphia to Leith with a cargo of timber. He did not see the light. The Hesperus was due at the Flannan Isles around the 20th of December. She was held back by weather. At about noon on the 26th, she came up on Eilean Mor. Harvey watched the rock through his glass as the Hesperus came in. No flag was flying, and Harvey sounded the Hesperus's steam whistle. There was no answer. He fired a distress rocket. There was no answer. Chapter 4, More on the Rock. Harvey launched the small boat with Joseph Mor in it, and 2 of the Hesperus' seamen with him. Mor climbed the long flight of stone steps up to the lighthouse compound. He found everything closed. His written account of what he found is dated the 28th of December, 2 days after he landed. Mor went in. The outer entrance door leading to the kitchen and storeroom was closed. The lightroom apparatus was in proper order. The lamps had been trimmed. The oil fountains and canteens had been filled. The beds were empty. The dishes had been washed and put away. The kitchen utensils were clean. Ducat's oilskins were missing. His sea boots were gone. Marshall's oilskins were missing. His sea boots were gone. The third set of oilskins, McArthur's, was still hanging on its peg inside the lighthouse. His weather coat was on the peg beside it. Whatever had taken McArthur out of the door, it had taken him in his shirt sleeves. He ran the Hesperus back to Louis. From the post office at Brestclete, he sent a wire that would become the founding sentence of the case. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannan. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. Harvey was an experienced master in those waters. He did not, in the moments after the discovery, reach for anything other than the rock and the sea. Chapter 5. The West Landing. Robert Muirhead arrived on the rock on the 29th of December. His report is dated the 8th of January 1901. At the East Landing, where the Hesperus had put Mor ashore, everything was in order. Whatever had happened, it happened on the other side of the island. The West Landing was approached by a flight of concrete steps descending the cliff to a small platform some 70 feet above the sea. But other things at and above the platform had been damaged in ways Muirhead recorded as difficult to credit. A wooden box used to store mooring, ropes, lines, and landing tackle was kept in a crevice of the rock, 110 feet above sea level. The box had been smashed, its contents drew into the cracks of the rock around it. Iron railings along the path running up from the platform had been wrenched out of their concrete anchor. A life buoy that had been lashed to those railings for emergency throw to a man fallen from the steps had been ripped clean away. A stone block weighing upwards of 1 ton had been displaced and rolled across the concrete path. And at the very top of the cliff, more than 200 feet above sea level, the turf had been ripped back several meters from the edge, the kind of damage that ocean engineers would now identify as a signature of green water falling from above, not blown spray. I am of opinion that the most likely explanation of the disappearance of the men is that they had all gone down on the afternoon of Saturday the 15th of December. 2 of the keepers had dressed for foul weather and gone down to the landing. The third, by the evidence of his oilskins still on the peg, had been in the lighthouse. I visited them as lately as the 7th of December and had the melancholy recollection that I was the last person to shake hands with them and bid them adieu. Chapter 6. The Layered Story. That is the documentary case, Joseph Moore's letter, Robert Muirhead's report, Harvey's telegram, the slate, and almost none of it what the popular telling of the case is built on. The popular telling has a half-eaten meal on the table. It has an overturned chair on the floor. It has a door gaping opened on us. It has 3 great black birds plunging into the sea as the relief boat comes in. None of this is in Joseph Mor's letter. None of it is in any document that survives from 1900 or 1901. It comes from a poem. In 1912, the English poet Wilfrid Wilson Gibson published a collection called Fires, Book 1, Coda. It included a narrative poem of about 110 lines titled Flannan Isles. He had read about the case in the popular press. He wrote a poem in the voice of a relief party arriving at the relief party. In the poem finds a table set for a meal, meat and cheese and bread, all untouched. It encounters on the way up to the lighthouse 3 queer black ugly birds, too big, the speaker says, or guillemot or shag. The half-eaten meal is a Gibson invention. The overturned chair is a Gibson invention. The 3 black birds are a Gibson invention. What Joseph Mor actually described was that the outer doors had been closed and the inner kitchen door. So almost everyone who has ever heard of the Flannan Isles case knows the famous logbook entries. December 12th, severe gale, sea lashed to fury, Ducat irritable. These entries are not in the Northern Lighthouse Board record. They have no manuscript existence. The historian Mike Dash traced all of this back through his citations in a long essay published in Fortean Studies, Volume 4, 1998. Together, those 2 papers are the floor under any responsible modern discussion of what is and is not in the record. Chapter 7, the modern reading, or the modern science that bears on the case, comes from a measurement made nearly a century after Muir had filed his report. On the 1st of January 1995, a laser altimeter beneath the Dropner gas platform in the North Sea recorded a single wave, 84 feet from trough to. It was the first instrumentally recorded rogue wave in deep water. Once a wave of that scale was instrumentally documented, the older anecdotal record from Scottish and Hebridean lighthouses became newly credible. The 200-foot turf stripping at the top of the Eilean Mor cliffs is exactly the kind of mark the modern literature now identifies. Muirhead's central conclusion, an unexpectedly large roller, describes in a 1901 vocabulary. Bella Bathurst's 1999 book, The Lighthouse Stevensons, gives the case its Stevenson family context. The Northern Lighthouse Board's own current public position is the same. It accepts Muirhead's 1901 conclusion. The most probable explanation is that an unusually large wave struck the west landing during an inspection and carried the man into the sea, and was taken in turn. Coda, the bag and the meal that was not there. The mystery of the Flannan Isles is not what killed the 3 keepers. Meteorology and physical evidence point to broke wave at the West Landing. The mysterious textual. Half of what we know about that December was invented by Wilfrid Wilson. He did so in a poem published in 1912. The other half was filled in by an early 20th century journalist whose fabricated logbook entries became, by repeated citation, the founding text of the popular case. There was no half-eaten meal on the table. And there was on its bag inside the lighthouse Donald McArthur's oilskins. It is the load-bearing detail of the case. A man ran out into a December afternoon on the open Atlantic in his shirt sleeves. And that is what a true story costs when its most famous details are their fiction. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald McArthur, a wave that came up the cliff on the afternoon of the 15th of December, 1900, and the silence afterwards, into which everyone has been writing ever since. Until then, keep them in mind. 3 keepers, 1 rock, and the poem that buried the truth.